Lecture-Recital and Evgeny for inviting me to present the Oxford Graduate Research Colloquium. Since I started my PhD in 2017, I have presented my research in numerous conferences, but unfortunately I still feel the necessity to introduce Louise Farrenc before talking more specifically about my research. Although there has been an increasing interest in female composers in the last few years, Louise Farrenc's name is still unknown to many people, even to some musicians. However, this was not the case during her time. So, Jeanne-Louise Dumont was born into a family that had a long tradition of 5 generations in fine art, and she was raised in an environment full of artistic inspiration. She studied piano with her godmother, Anne-Elisabeth Cécile Soria, who was a student of Muzio Clementi, and later with Ignaz Moscheles and Johann Nepomuk Hummel. Due to the fact that she could not be admitted to the composition class of the Paris Conservatoire because of her gender, she studied composition privately with Antonin Rescha. At the age of 17, Louise married Aristide Farrenc, a flutist and later music publisher, and together they had a daughter, Louise Victorine, who also became a prominent pianist but died at the age of 33. Louise Farrenc won twice the Prix Chartier, a prize for chamber music later awarded to Edouard Lalo, César Franck, and Gabriel Fauré, among others. With her husband, she published Le Trésor de Pianiste, a 20-volume anthology of keyboard music containing pieces from Girolamo Frescobaldi to Frédéric Chopin. Her compositions are not limited to piano repertoire, but also include orchestral works, chamber music, and songs. The first female piano professor at the Paris Conservatoire was Hélène de Montgerould, but she only taught there for 3 years. The second female professor was Farrenc, who taught there for almost 30 years. However, she was not paid equally to her male colleagues, not until 7 years after her employment, and she was allowed to teach only female students. So women could not be admitted to classes other than piano, harp, and singing, and women professors could not teach male students. Imagine that there were even separate entrances to the conservatoire for men and women. Farrenc taught composition only privately. One of her students was Ernest Rieu, famous opera composer and music critic. Her appointment as a piano professor at the Paris Conservatoire was made at the same time as that of Henri Herz, a famous pianist who also lived in Paris, the first superstar that appeared in the piano faculty of the Paris Conservatoire, according to Kern Holman. Herz and Farrenc held 2 of the 3 piano classes for women. Her teaching position seems to have influenced her compositional activity to a great extent. Farrenc, after her appointment as a piano professor, composed mainly for chamber ensembles and orchestra. Her piano compositions were limited to 3 sets of etudes and a few other pieces which were dedicated to her students. Farrenc's 4 sets of etudes, which were the focus of my doctoral thesis, were composed in reverse order of difficulty, starting with the most complex set. As you can see, Opus 26 was composed before Farrenc commenced her teaching career at the Paris Conservatoire, and the other sets during her second decade as a professor. The sets of etudes had titles that related either to the keys in which they were composed, their character, or the level of difficulty. These titles can be found on the manuscripts and the first edition of the sets. The Alphonse Leduc edition, published posthumously in 1876, was a 6-volume series entitled L'École du Pianiste, and placed the sets of etudes in order of difficulty, starting with the easiest. The Trente Études d'André Letton Margaret Mineur, Opus 26, was split into 2 volumes and was the only set out of the 4 that kept its original title. The other sets' titles were changed to Deux études de dextérité, 20 études de genre et de mécanisme, and 25 études progressives. The final volume of the 6 was the Exercice du pianiste sur la modulation, exercises that Louise Farrenc composed in order to facilitate the transition from one key to another between the pieces performed. It was a style, let's say, sense of preluding, a type of preluding between the pieces. Before the commencement of my PhD, there had been very little research undertaken on Louise Farrenc, apart from Bear Friedland's seminal dissertation in 1975, which is until today the main source of biographical information of Farrenc. Catherine Legras, Andreas Tischhauser, with his dissertation on Farrenc's Tree Opus 45, and the publication of some of Farrenc's works by Florian Neutel as music editions have also contributed to the revival of interest in Farrenc's music. This lack of more in-depth information about Farrenc's works stimulated me to research her piano compositions, particularly her 4 sets of etudes. The first recording featuring Farrenc's etudes was in 1979 by Musical Heritage Society and the American pianist Jenna Rapps. 3 more followed between 2003 and 2005, around the bicentennial anniversary of Farrenc's birth, and the latest was released in February 2020 by Steinway & Sons, featuring the American pianist John Polk. So my research intended to fill this gap by addressing Louise Farrenc's etudes for piano and creating the first professional recording of all the etudes, which was released last October by Grand Piano Records. My interpretation was based on the performance implications that arise from techniques, stylistic allusions, and references to composer earlier and contemporary with Farrenc, an analytical study of the structure of her etudes, and my personal experience as a practitioner. Excerpts and entire etudes performed on an Erard piano supported my findings regarding the technical and musical differences of performing them on a period instrument and a modern piano, for example, questions around the indicated pedaling and tempo marks. Hence, my approach involved performance analysis to explore the shape of musical ideas and the technical aspects of the etudes, and a comparative analysis of the few existing recordings of other performers with my own to investigate the various performance approaches as suggested by Nicholas Cook. A thorough study of the manuscripts and a comparison with published sources where references exist led to a better understanding of the compositional process, as did the musical and technical indications implied through the suggested fingering and the use of specific musical language. The study of the manuscripts also provided information on the time of composition of the etudes, the type of manuscript, for example, if they were the first manuscript where the etudes were composed, or a copy used for their engraving, the engraving process, even if Farrenc did the editing. The comparison of all available editions did not only result in the production of a new scholarly edition of a complete set of the etudes on which I'm working at the moment, but also in an understanding of the influence this comparison and the study of the manuscripts have on performance. Consequently, my research may be viewed under the scope of 3 major areas: performance, musicology, and analysis. As today's presentation is focused on the process of deciding the most historically informed and accurate representation of Farrenc's performance intentions, based primarily on the analysis of her manuscript scores and historical editions, I'm going to give you some examples of my findings and how this influenced my performance of her etudes, and how they still influence my performance of the rest of her piano works. For Farrenc's 4 sets of etudes, this table shows the manuscripts and the editions that have been published from Farrenc's time to the present. All of Farrenc's sets of etudes were published during her lifetime, primarily by her husband's publishing firm. Only the manuscript of Opus 42 and the first edition of Opus 50 have not been recovered. Katharina Herwig supports the view that Farrenc's Opus 26 set of etudes was composed in 1838. Her conclusion is based on an article found in France Musicale in April 1838, commenting on the completion of a part of Opus 26 etudes. Farrenc even performed 8 of the etudes in the Pleyel Salon in May of the same year, according with her Opus 25 Grand Variation sur un thème du Comte Kallenberg, and her 2 compositions for choir, but this does not necessarily indicate that all the etudes of this set were composed that year. This set includes 3 fugues. Surprisingly, the manuscript score for Farrenc's Opus 22 fugues, composed in 1833, is missing the first 3 fugues, and starts with number 4, which could mean that these pieces could have been removed from Opus 22 in order to be included in Opus 26. In the case of the Opus 50 etudes, not even the exact year of its first publication can be proved. In her published dissertation on Louise Farrenc, Bea Friedland gives 1859 to 1863 as the possible time span of this set's first publication, and even hesitates to assert that it was published by Farrenc. On the other hand, Heitmann shortens the proposed publication period to 1861 by using the plate numbers of Farrenc's neighboring works. Opus 50 plate number was AF 123, as is evident in Farrenc's manuscript score. Works with plate numbers AF 121 and AF 122 were published in 1861 and AF 124 in 1863. This is a reasonable point. However, following this logic, we should place the publication date of his second violin sonata, Opus 39, before 1855, the year that Opus 42 with plate number AF 111 was published, and not before 1856, as Heitmann does. The Opus 42 copy of the legal deposit, which is dated 1855, already contains Opus 39, as can be evidenced here. Opus 41 was included as well, albeit without its title, but it was only published 3 years later. Therefore, the method of identifying the publication date of Farrenc's works, in this case of Opus 50, based on the publication dates of the works with neighboring plate numbers, is not completely reliable and should be employed cautiously, and further sources should be considered where possible. For Farrenc's etudes Opus 50, we cannot even be precise about the date of their composition. Most of these etudes were composed on a different sheet of paper, and the manuscript pages correspond to 9 different types of paper. Despite the fact that most of them were composed on paper supplied by either Lardesnold or Dantier, as can be provided by the stamps found on them, their different measurements suggest different periods of composition. What is most striking is that etude Opus 50 number 13 was composed on the type of paper that was used for the engraving process of her etudes Opus 41. Not only are the color of the paper and its measurements the same, but also their marks are extremely similar. This supports my view that this etude was composed as early as 1853, according to the Opus 41 compositional time. On the other hand, the stamp found on etude Opus 50 number 22 must be the same as the one found on the manuscript of Victorine Farrenc's Theme and Variation Fragments, which reads Lardesnold, Paris 23 Rue Feydeau, and on one sketch on Farrenc's arrangement of Mozart's piano sonata for violin and piano. Because 23 Rue Feydeau was the address that Lardesnold printing house used before 1849, this etude could have been composed as early as 1849 or even before that. Likewise, the stamp found on etude Opus 50 number 12 reads Dantier. It does. It's difficult, but it does. The address found on that stamp is Boulevard du Temple 33 or 35, so the number supposed to be on the right of the stamp, which was the printing house's address after 1859. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that this etude was composed after 1859. This finding contradicts the notion that Farrenc discontinued her compositional activity after her daughter's death. Although she did cease the production of large-scale works, this discovery, as well as the existence of a number of works without an opus number, which were not published or dated, questions the validity of that assumption. Certainly, the dating of the papers that Farrenc used for these etudes does not necessarily confirm that these were the dates of their composition. She could have just used them to compose or even copy them. However, I strongly believe that this set probably consists of pieces that Farrenc composed at different periods of time without necessarily having the intention of publishing them as set of etudes for her younger students. By the time she decided to collect them into a set, they had already been composed, and simply needed to be placed in order. The number of Farrenc's pieces without opus numbers that remained unpublished during her lifetime and their low level of difficulty support my view. Apart from the large-scale changes that are clear from the use of papers pasted over the main composition, there are many small-scale alterations that can be grouped under 4 categories. Individual notes being erased, crossed out, or changed in pitch or length, change of passages, changes of expressive and dynamic markings, structural changes. For example, the alteration of the ending in Etude Opus 26 number 9 uncovers the ambiguity of the performance directions present in these bars. The 2 bars that were intended to be the last of this etude have been crossed out. The quiet ending has been substituted by a furious arpeggio wipe of the keyboard. This way, instead of the very quiet ending that would be expected by the listener, we have a surprisingly flamboyant one, reminiscent of the middle section of this etude. Perhaps this change was made after Farrenc placed the etudes in order. If your intention was for this set to be performed in its entirety, then the fast ending in this etude would contrast with the character and speed of the adagio of etude number 10 and be more effective as a result. However, the indication a poco in bar 75-76 is ambiguous. Does it refer to the ritenuto or to the following indications, the a tempo or the forte? The answer may be found in the manuscript of her Opus 13. Farrenc had written a poco in pencil in bars 261 to 62, but then inked it in only in bar 262, probably to demonstrate that this was intended for the crescendo that follows in bars 263 to 64. If this is the case here, the term could refer to the forte or the a tempo in bar 79, or even to both, implying this way a crescendo and accelerando. Ritenuto, she would have indicated rallentando instead, as she did in her Opus 26 number 28 etude. It is obvious there that the position of the ritenuto, which is distinct from the rallentando that eventually prevails, concerned Farrenc and supports my view that the a poco refers to one of the following indications, the forte or the a tempo, or both of them. Performing this passage, the ritenuto should not be read on its own, but with a dolce. It is after all indicated as dolce e ritenuto, meaning that these should be realized simultaneously, even though they are not written in the same bar. The ritenuto is further emphasized in bar 76, with the trill in the right hand and the accent on the F and natural in the left hand, which require additional time to have the desirable attention and effect. If Farrenc's intention was to have a rallentando in bar 73-78 and a sudden return to the previous tempo in bar 79, then I believe she would have written rallentando instead of ritenuto, and it would also be more effective if there were a pause on the last quaver of the bar. And would be more emphatic if it were placed in bar 77, preparing arpeggiated A major chords in terms of both dynamic and tempo. Focusing only on the preparation of the fast tempo would result in a sudden and unexpected forte with an accent in bar 79. would not seem sensible, since the passage does not end, for example, with long chords in the tempo of the ritenuto, and a simple crescendo would be sufficient in that case. The first edition of all Farrenc's etudes were published by Aristide Farrenc. All 4 sets have his initials next to their plate numbers. However, opus 41 and 42 bear the indication Cés Lauter and not his name, as it is found on the title page of the opus 26 etudes, probably because he dissolved his publishing firm in 1837. The first edition of her opus 26 set, which is available at the Bibliothèque Nationale, was drawn from a book containing 3 sets of Farrenc's etudes, opuses 42, 41 and 26 in this order. This volume bears 2 stamps on its first page, Legs Alice Ducasse and C. circa 1924. Alice Ducasse was Louise Farrenc's student at the Paris Conservatoire, so that's supposed to be back there, from 1861 until 1863, but became an opera singer. It is safe to assume that the 3 sets were put together in this book before or during the years of Ducasse's studies at the Conservatoire, and definitely before the publication of Farrenc's Etudes Opus 50, since that set is not included here. Their compilation in one tome of just the first 3 sets enhances my argument that perhaps it was not Farrenc's intention to produce another set of etudes, and the pieces that formed Opus 50 were indeed composed without the etude title in her mind. This tome is also the only available source of the Opus 26 first edition at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Although Aristide Farrenc's firm published these first editions, there are several discrepancies between the manuscript score and the first editions, which can alter many details in the performance of these etudes. From the omission of dynamic hairpins to the changes of notes or even entire passages, there are changes that were made at the proof stage to correct the score or clarify the intentions of the composers, and others that were made in error and are therefore deceptive for the performer and lead to false interpretations of the score. Most of the small-scale alterations, for example the addition of certain accidentals, are very easily perceived as corrections of details that were missed during the composition of these works. Unfortunately, the manuscript score of Opus 42 has not so far been discovered, but similar inconsistencies between the manuscript and the first edition can be found for Opuses 41 and 50. The first edition of Opus 50 has not been located, but since the second edition by Leduc using the same plates is almost identical to the first one, conclusions can be reached by examining the second edition. Since the first editions were published by Aristide Farrenc's firm during Louise Farrenc's lifetime, I suggest that they were Farrenc's latest version of the score, and I try to explain the reasons behind the changes that have taken place. In order to achieve that, I employed my knowledge of harmony, my understanding of Farrenc's notation from the study of the manuscripts of all her piano works, my analytical and observational skills, my experience as a pianist, and the musical taste I have developed through my musical education. However, there are also instances where I support that the manuscript is more accurate. As Roy Hout mentions, the repeated lessons for editors and performers is that the composer's copying and revising processes mix improvements with inadvertent corruptions, sometimes making an earlier source more definitive in certain passages. For Etudes 41 and 42, there are 2 versions of the first edition. We have 2 identical copies in Paris for version 1. One is located at the Bibliothèque Nationale and the other is the legal deposit copy, which is to be found at the Médiathèque Hector Berlioz at the Paris Conservatoire. Versions B are also located at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Their hard copy are part of Alice Ducasse's book. Both versions are the same plate number, front page, and engraving details. However, meticulous comparison between the 2 reveals their differences. Either versions A were a proofreading score that were submitted to the Dépôt Légal, and versions B the final corrected proofs, or versions A were published first and versions B were a later reprint. The discrepancies found between the two versions of each opus are mostly the addition of accidentals for clarification purposes or the correction of the fingering position due to the engraving mistakes in version A. Despite Farrenc's mainly clear handwriting, there are instances where the correct notes may be inferred only from their context. There is one case where, in my opinion, the wrong note was printed in the first edition. I am referring to the Opus 15 number 10 etude, bar 24b. In the manuscript, the meaning in the tenor line is not clearly an A or a G sharp. However, in the second edition, it has been printed as an A. Actually, it would make more sense to be G sharp because of the continuous line in the tenor, but all available editions display A here. If this is the correct note, a possible solution in performance might be to project the G sharp more when it finally appears in bar 25, but this is possibly not the case here. As in bars 24 to 37, we have the repetition of the same motive in the left hand. The G sharp would be more viable and interesting, and it would function as a complete neighbor because of the A in the bass. This case becomes still more ambiguous when we look at the manuscript of her Opus 15 number 24 etude. In bar 15 we find an X sol reference in the margin. The note it refers to looks indeed like G, but Farrenc, or the engraver, chooses to clarify this with a comment. Does that mean that in number 10 the note is A after all? However, in number 25, bar 13, the same kind of writing is present for the F sharp, but this has not been questioned so far by any of the editions. The only way of reaching a valid outcome in this case, apart from examining the harmonic and musical validity of each opinion, is looking very closely at the way Farrenc writes the notes. In the last two instances where the notes are written in a space, the bottom line of her note does not extend to the line above or on its right-hand side. Observing closely the note in number 10, we can see that the same applies here. Consequently, there is almost no doubt that the note there is G sharp. In the piano tradition, etudes have been widely and mistakenly regarded as mere exercises for the technical development of the pianist. The majority of the 19th century pieces under this title are largely performed as finger exercises by pianists of all abilities and levels, and they are rarely included in concert programs, mainly because of their pedagogical and musical connotations of their characterization as etudes. Farrenc's sets not only develop the technical and musical qualities of the pianist, but they also contribute to enriching the knowledge of the aesthetics and the performance styles of major composers before and during her time. Bea Friedler, referring to Farrenc's etudes, Opus 26, writes, "But the composer plainly aspires to something beyond the usual didactic goal of perfecting technique. She aims equally at cultivating a sense of history by introducing the pianist to a wide range of keyboard styles from Bach's time to her own." Farrenc's inclusion of the three fugues in her Opus 26, which clearly trace back to Bach's fugues, as well as a number of resemblances of her etudes to other composers' pieces, attest to this. We could also suggest that Farrenc's etudes serve as performance guidance for those pieces. The first variation in Hummel's variations on the March from Opera Saint-Lyon Opus 40, found in the third volume of the Trésor des Pianistes, is almost identical in texture and melodic contours to Farrenc's etude Opus 26 number 7. Here we can observe the tutto legato, sempre legato, and the same dynamic marking piano in both pieces. The andante espressivo written in Farrenc's piece could be a direct tempo and performance implication for Hummel's variations, since the latter lacks metronome indications. Also, the Adagio Cantabile from Beethoven's Pathetic Sonata is very similar in key, texture, and structure to Farrenc's Etude Opus 26, number 21, especially from bar 9. The most significant difference regarding the performance of these two openings is the absence of the portato in the penultimate measure of Farrenc's Etude. If Farrenc was familiar with Adam's Méthode du piano du conservatoire and his explanation of the performance of portato, that the notes with portato to be played slightly later, dislocated, then perhaps this omission is Farrenc's guidance that she does not wish these chords in her etude to be played with retardation and non-legato, but legato and on the beat. It could even suggest that she advises the same for Beethoven's excerpt as well. This is Adam's, yeah. Good. So, Beethoven's bar 9. It is also apparent that Farrenc used some of the writing techniques of other composers of her time in her etudes. Apart from her Opus 26, number 10, which is the most profound example of Chopin's character in her etudes, the accents that we find in the right hand of Opus 41, number 6, which also resembles the opening bars of Schubert's A-flat minor Impromptu, are directly relevant to those in the opening bars of Chopin's Opus 10, numbers 1, 8, and 12. As in Chopin's etudes, these accents should not be performed literally. Perhaps, as Roy Howard explains, they could mean let the hand fall. This interpretation works for Farrenc's passage and results in a more open sound. It could also signify the caution the performer should take against accenting the wrong notes, especially the thumb, as Pauli suggests, and a rhythmical displacement. This does not mean that the first note should be accented, but the pianist should aim for an even sound without any accents. In that sense, the indicated accents are the reaction force against the natural accentuation of the thumb, and therefore eliminate its action, resulting in a smooth and round sound with no angles. Farrenc could have met Chopin or even heard him playing his works, either because of their common acquaintance, Auguste Franchomme, who was one of Chopin's close friends, and Farrenc's colleague at the Conservatoire, as well as a regular performer of her chamber works, or because Chopin and Farrenc always lived not far from each other. Farrenc was an advocate of the French style sévère, as described by Ian Pace. Apart from the detached articulation, the zélieu was also employed in her works to a great extent, associating to some extent her music with her feminine characteristics that were attributed to this style of performing. While she acknowledged the masters of the past did not simply copy them, as Friedland suggests, her affection towards their compositional style prevented her from being a pioneer of the time. Nevertheless, a few days after her death, La Revue et Gazette Musicale de Paris published her necrology, where the author, C.B., writes that if as a teacher, if as a teacher Madame Farrenc leaves a trace that will not fade away soon, it is even more as a composer that she will live in the history of music. Her works bear witness to a strength and a wealth of imagination, as well as to a science that has never been to the same degree before her the prerogative of a woman. She tackled the most difficult genres without fear and succeeded. Madame Farrenc, who had been conscious of the serious nature of her talent for a long time, did not follow the road of easy success. If the public does not know her name, it is up to the artists who know that this eminent woman was worth to pay tribute to her in the most useful way for her memory, that is to say, by letting the creations of that distinguished spirit be heard, so that young composers can learn, as with classical masters, how to combine charm with a correctness of form and grace with technical skill. My findings from researching Farrenc's etudes during my PhD have considerably shaped my performance of her piano music, and as I will be recording her complete piano works by the end of 2025, which marks the 150th anniversary from Farrenc's death, this is a work in progress that I hope it will also produce my critical edition of her complete piano works, as well as a book on Farrenc's piano school. References? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk and the beautiful performance at the beginning. I'd now like to open up for any questions that anyone might have. Does anyone have anything? Are there any in the chat?
I guess as someone who's also interested in as of yet not that well-known women composers, do you have advice, especially going into producing critical editions? How much weight do you put into the existing editions versus the manuscripts if they exist, and also do you have tips for finding modern editions that want to do this maybe not very lucrative work of publishing women composers?
So I can feel your anxiety about that. Because that was my problem. So when I first started recording, I supposedly had, or maybe I shouldn't say that on Zoom, and show the edition that I consulted when I first began my PhD. Because supposedly it was a critical edition of 2 sets of Farrenc's etudes, a modern one. But it was full of mistakes, and so full that I had to re-record the pieces again, because So the first point of reference, I think, should be the manuscripts course and the first editions, especially if they were published during the composer's life. So that means that they had a say, let's say, they had a certain level of influencing the editions, even if they were not the engravers or the editors themselves. Apart from that, of course, I'm not saying that all modern critical editions are not useful. So for the etudes by Farrenc, I also consulted all the historical editions, so even after the first edition that were published in other countries, apart from France, and then, of course, modern editions. So, to be honest and fair, there were some corrections also in the critical editions, but still, when there are false assumptions, let's say, of because there's an accent here, there should also be an accent there, but it's not the same pattern that is followed, and they are not placed in, let's say, brackets, so that the reader, the musician, knows that they are the editor's opinion and not what was on the paper, on the manuscript, or was not the intention of the composer. So it's kind of difficult, and it should be taken case by case, actually. We cannot just say that all critical editions are not good or all critical editions are good. We should always have a critical eye, and even as performers, that it's not our job, let's say, to look at all the details at the back. Well, it is our job actually to look at all the details. Forward and the appendices at the end, we should consult them, and we should actually look into these cases very critically, just one by one, because yes, they might be correct, they might not be correct in their opinion, because we are all humans. Composers were humans. They probably made a mistake during the composition stage. They made probably mistakes during the first editions. Editors nowadays are still human beings. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes. I don't say that my edition will be flawless. I hope it will be flawless, but I just hope, because there are so many things that can interfere along the way from my hand going after, or even perhaps I'm mistaken in some of my opinions about how we should perform and what is right in terms of notes and slurs and all that. So it is personal, and we should be cautious, I think. That explains. Yeah, I hope I've answered your question. Yes, Laura?
Hi, thank you. I was curious about a change of title with the second edition of the Beauties. What was the reason?
No reason at all. This was 1 year after Farrenc's death. There is nothing in the manuscripts or anywhere else that suggests a change of titles. I suppose perhaps it would be to attract, if they found that these titles would be more attractive for the public, I don't know.
Yeah.
But he placed them in order of difficulty, or yes, no, yes, in order of difficulty, and yeah, perhaps he also changed the titles for this reason.
Yeah.
Even in some of them, the dedicatee has changed in one of them, in that later edition. So I think it's just a mistake, that, at least, of the dedicatee. But the titles, I think it's just personal opinion of the editor. And he also added the preluding method of Farrenc. So perhaps he thought that this was appropriate as teaching, let's say, as etudes are mostly educational, let's say, pieces. Perhaps preluding was also a method of preluding would be suitable for that series that he produced that year.
So the preluding would be prior to what?
So Farrenc suggested preluding is a way of connecting the pieces. So starting from, I think I have a slide, or not. Let me check. So she would connect the pieces starting from one key leading to the other. I don't think I inserted that after all. No, I think preluding is out. Nope. No, I have other things, but not the preluding. So she started, let's say, from C major. She had a series of chords going from C major to all the keys. C major to D flat, C major to D major, C major to E flat, C major to E major. So a series of chords, and then she also had, let's say, a sample of how these chords can be used. So it could be either scales, arpeggios, or whatever, but going through these tonalities of the chords. And so it was not only to introduce a piece, but to connect the pieces together.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've come across that with German song, but not with piano pieces in the same way. But
yeah, but it was the practice of the time anyway to introduce the pieces. So if they were playing a movement by Beethoven's sonata, they would play something shorter at the beginning to tell the audience, the concert starts, or the piece that is the main piece will start shortly, so they would play something short. So preluding was very frequent. And Farrenc obviously wanted her students to learn how to prelude between pieces. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions?
This is just a of the Schubert impromptu. I don't know, is there any...
Yeah. This is what I said, yeah.
Yeah, because you compared it to Chopin, but it's also so similar to
Yeah,
Chopin.
also to Schubert, yes, I said about Schubert.
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Do we know, was she very familiar with Schubert's music, or
I don't think so.
are her songs somehow comparable?
No, not at all. I mean, her songs were not even published. There are just very few songs by Farrenc. No. No, I don't find, apart from that, of course, I don't think there is any other similarity with Schubert.
Yeah, my question is a little bit broad. I'm wondering, as a performer and an interpreter, how might you feel that you situate yourself within the composer's intentions, the dynamics, and when you answer to these questions you mentioned, the critical dimensions? Thank you.
So sorry if I understood correctly, let me repeat that. So how much I'm influenced as a performer by the composer's intentions, so I don't add my things, you mean?
No,
Or
it's not like making judgment, just trying to maybe hear your opinions, how you feel about these dynamics of yourself as a performer and interpreter, and there's like a huge composer's intention, there's like dynamics.
Yeah. There were only very few places where I completely disagreed with what was on the score. That was not in the manuscript, not in the first edition, not anywhere else. But playing it over and over again, and again saying that I've seen places where the manuscript was wrong, and it was wrong because the same passage was in different lines, and they took the performance, let's say, direction from one line and they placed it on the other one in the edition. So looking at these things, I only changed a couple of them. And because I felt really strongly about that, it cannot be like that. I mean, as my teacher says, you have to try it 100 of times first, like the way it is on the score. And if you still feel very strongly about it, then okay, because you have still performed it so much, you have, let's say, the authority to change it. But still, we're performers and we always do things slightly different, or we always add something of our own taste in our interpretations. But I've tried to eliminate that in my interpretation, so I've mostly followed what she said, apart from just a couple of bits, a couple of passages. Thank you.
I'm interested in these millions that are slightly ambiguous, that sort of cross over into the line sometimes. Was there quite a lot of them?
No.
No. Okay.
No. There was not many of them, but so that was one of the mistakes, let's say, that I found in the critical edition. And I thought, oh my God, this is not A, this is G. This is G sharp. It's definitely G sharp. And I found that when I was looking at the manuscripts, but everything else was A. And so I tried to find similar places to justify, let's say, that this is a G sharp and not an A. But there were not. Mostly her handwriting was very clear, very clear.
So you explained about the using the length of the tails from other places. But
Yeah.
Did you sort of use analysis to inform these decisions
Yeah.
usually as well?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So if it was A and G sharp, then A and G sharp, it was going to be a complete neighbor. But if it was A, so the G sharp would come much later, and it didn't make any sense. Why would it be A and then G sharp A all the time? So yeah. I mean, so there were a few instances, but still I had to look very closely. And it's not very easy when you have to do with handwriting, because, okay, again, it's the hand, it may have slipped a little bit more or less, so we again cannot be sure, but harmonic analysis also helped with that. Complete neighbor, we have base A, so G sharp A makes sense. And it's more interesting to have it from the start and differentiate every time it comes. Than have A and then G sharp. It's too late to have it.
in that case, I think we'll wrap it up because we're at the end of our session anyway. But thank you so much,
Thank you.
Maria.
Thank you
It
so
was
much.
such a good talk. So can we please have